Hi, today we're speaking to David Christian on history. How are you, David?
I'm good, thanks.
So, to start us off, why do you believe it's important for young people to have this broader perspective on history?
Because the best way of explaining that, I think, is with an analogy. All societies we know of have, within traditional religions or indigenous traditions, they have taught young people how things came to be as they were. That's a society's sort of core story. And that story embraces the future, the past, the whole of space and time, and it tells you where you are in space and time. If it's well told, it's also inspiring, so it can motivate you. And those core stories, and they're embedded in all the traditional religions, those core stories can also guide you, tell you what sort of actions are most important, what sort of actions are needed given where you are and when you are. And so that's a roundabout answer to your question. Conventional forms of history, I taught Russian history for many, many years, um, are immensely valuable in lots of ways. But I feel what they do is the subliminal message they give is a sort of nationalistic one. It's one that tells you that the most important structure in your life is the nation you belong to. Now, in a world with nuclear weapons, I'm not sure that's a very good message to be giving. So I think it's really important that history nowadays can give people a sense of belonging to a planetary community, because the problems we face today are going to require collaboration across the world. The world is now so tightly, intimately globalized. It has such powerful technologies and dangerous technologies that we're now all of us in this together. So I think we need a broader sort of history than the history we taught in the past, one which does some of the things that traditional religions did by giving you a sense of your place in space and time according to the best knowledge of the society you live in. That's a roundabout answer to your question, but I hope it sort of got there finally.
No, it absolutely did. Thank you so much. And when discussing the problems we're dealing with today, are there any strategies that have been used in the past that we could use today to try help overcome these strategies in trying to create a peaceful society as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that today's world in so many ways is radically different from the world of the past. But there are important similarities. Um, we know that all human societies have had mechanisms, and these core stories I was talking about are part of the mechanisms for holding society together, for allowing people to work together, to work with each other. That there's always a bit of tension, a bit of competition, but fundamentally to collaborate on the project of ensuring that everyone can flourish as much as possible. Now, that is something that we need to transfer to today's world, but we need to transfer it to a global world so that we think not in terms of Australian human beings or Russian human beings or South African human beings, but of human beings, period. And human beings and all the other creatures that we are now becoming responsible for, because what we do in the next few decades will shape the future of our own descendants, but also of millions of other species.
Yeah, and how has our understanding of the Earth's development evolved over time, and what were some key turning points in our knowledge?
Our understanding of the Earth's development
Yeah.
has evolved actually very rapidly in the last 2 centuries. Even 200 years ago, most people thought that the universe as a whole, and probably planet Earth and most of the species on it, had not changed fundamentally over time. Only in the last 2 centuries have we realized that the universe has a history. It was very different in the past. It has a birth moment. It's evolving. that the planet has a history too, that life has a history, that species are evolving. So we've learned a lot about the nature of change over time and on very, very large scales, a huge amount in just the last 2 centuries. And seeing human history and the present moment in human history in that larger context of the history of planet Earth reveals some, I think, very important insights about the astonishing moment we're living in at the moment. In fact, the moment we're living in right now, I believe strongly, is a sort of turning point in planetary history. Life has been on Earth for almost 4 billion years, but never before has a single species wielded so much power that it will determine the fate of most of the planet. That's never happened before. This is something brand new in 4 billion years. And only if you stand back and take a very wide view of history not just of humanity, but also of planet Earth, can you actually see these things. And seeing these things is really important because it helps us see the challenges that we face in the near future. And the challenges really are how to manage a planet so that our own species and other species can flourish.
Yep. So I have a few questions, and one of them is, if we do cause the fate of this planet, when do you believe it will happen, and will it happen in the next 200, 300 years, and how so?
Oh, we live well. I mean, we live at a very dangerous moment. Look, here's one way of putting it. 200 years ago, the most dangerous weapons on Earth were probably cannons. Now, cannons or mortars could inflict appalling damage, but over a small area. Just 200 years later, we have weapons, nuclear weapons, that could ruin much of the biosphere in just a few hours or a few days. Can we get control of that? Now, there are other ways in which we humans have technologies so powerful that they could cause existential crises. One, of course, is the burning of fossil fuels. We are now transforming the world's climate system. This year, this northern summer is beginning to see more drastic climate events than we've seen for a long, long time. So we're beginning to transform the climate in ways that could profoundly undermine human society. Now, I don't need to go on. We all know what the existential crises are. We could manufacture bugs that get around the world in 24 hours and decimate much of human society. So can we collaborate across the world in dealing with these problems? We know that the challenges are going to be there for many decades. I suspect that the next 2 or 3 centuries are a critical turning point, because eventually it may be that humans start settling other planets. And then an existential crisis on one planet it won't be the end of humanity. It'll be pretty catastrophic, but it won't be the end of humanity. So it's as if we're facing a sort of bottleneck for the next few centuries. And the one crucial thing we can say is that if we do not collaborate globally, the chances of getting through that bottleneck are significantly reduced.
And can you elaborate on what communicating and collaborating properly actually means? I mean, how should we go about trying to solve these issues in the near future?
Well, modern science is absolutely astonishing. It's generated technologies of terrifying power, but it also means that we can see things and find solutions to problems that would have been unthinkable in the past. Well, I think when I was a child, no one talked about climate change. No one understood it. We now have a very good understanding of the nature of climate change and what needs to be done. Well, I think knowing what needs to be done, everyone knows what needs to be done. The challenge is to actually do it. And we see today how conflicts between wealthier nations and poorer nations, localized wars such as the emerging civil war in Sudan and the war between Russia and Ukraine, mean that there are still, we humans are still sort of fighting each other at the regional level. Can we learn to collaborate globally? There are many reasons for optimism, by the way. The United Nations has organized conferences that have got the support of almost every member nation for dealing seriously with issues such as climate change, but also making commitments to dealing with issues such as declining biodiversity, inequality, and so on. Now, we can be very cynical about whether those commitments will be fulfilled. But if you think about it, the fact that every country, every government on Earth has more or less agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals, to the Paris climate change goals, is itself an astonishing thing. So there is growing evidence of our capacity to collaborate at the global level. Will we learn to do it fast enough? That's a question that your generation is more likely to get the answer to than my generation.
Yeah, and we're now discussing how the future might unpack in the next century or two. I'm going to try and link the past with the future. What do you believe is the most remarkable and surprising connection between different eras or civilizations that you've discovered during your research?
Humans are very, very fallible. I think the huge difference between now and earlier eras of human history is that eras could now have existential consequences. In other words, they could destroy humanity. That was never really true before. Plagues or catastrophic wars devastated entire regions, or pandemics, never before. So it's as if we'll probably keep repeating many of the same errors in the past, but now they've suddenly become much more dangerous than they ever have before. And that's why learning new ways of collaborating on a global level is so important. And that, by the way, is why I think teaching history as the history of humanity and of the biosphere is so crucial. Because as long as we teach history as the history of nations, we encourage the idea that this is a world of competing nations. And that is an idea that is becoming increasingly dangerous.
Yeah, and what are some insights that history can provide us about the fundamental questions of human existence and the pursuit of happiness?
Look, gosh, you're asking me some huge questions. Let me have a go at some aspects of that question. I believe that if you look at the past on a large enough scale, you can ask questions about what makes us humans so different in new ways. I said earlier that I think we live at a turning point in planetary history. And the turning point is created by the activities of our own species, human beings. Because together we have generated technologies and powers and capabilities that are now on the scale of a planet. They make us a planet-changing force. So that raises the question, what is it about us human beings that makes us different from every species that has existed for 4 billion years? And I actually think there's a pretty simple answer staring us in the face, and it's what I call collective learning. We humans can share ideas, right? We're doing it right now, with a sort of precision and a volume that no other species can manage. Many species of mammals can share information, but just not on the same scale. The result of that is that information, that is to say, knowledge about how to manage your environment, has accumulated within our species from generation to generation in a way that it doesn't seem to have done with any other species. Now, you wait long enough, and a species that has access to a growing body of knowledge about how to manage and manipulate and change its surroundings eventually that species is going to dominate change on the planet. So we as human beings are radically different. Now, this is not good or bad, it's just the way things are. It's potentially dangerous, but it also means that we may have the skills needed to navigate our way to a better future.
Yeah, and we're discussing for the most part how the future might not be looking that great for humans in terms of the inventions we've made to destroy each other per se. How can we maintain a sense of hope and optimism in the face of adversity when drawing inspiration from the stories of lessons from the past?
Look, well, there are several reasons why one should be optimistic. I mean, the first is kind of tactical. Pessimism doesn't really lead you anywhere. Let's put it this way, we face huge dangers as a species. So our job is to thread the needle, is to find a way through them. That's our task. Now, if we're pessimistic, we'll give up on that job. So the first reason for optimism is that only if you are optimistic that there is a solution will you have the motivation to seek that solution. That's the first thing. So here's the second thing. If you look at the whole history of humanity, then there are several persistent things, and one of them is our astonishing, how can I put it, creativity. It's scientific creativity, it's artistic creativity, it's technological creativity. And it's not really the creativity of individuals, it's a sort of collective creativity that arises from the sharing of ideas. Now, what that suggests is that if this is a profound feature of our species, it will continue into the future. So if creativity is a precondition for finding solutions to the problems we face, the technological problems, the biological problems, the political problems, if creativity is a precondition for solving those, we are the most creative species around. So that is another very powerful reason for optimism. And let me give you a third. I've already touched on it. If you look at the large sweep of history and you ask the question, can humans collaborate at a global scale to solve these problems? Your first reaction may be to look at the conflicts that have dominated human history. But a second reaction may be to look at the fact that humans have managed to collaborate on larger and larger scales. Your podcast is just one example of the fact that conversations are now global. People can feel connections, ties, commitments on a global scale. So there are many reasons for optimism about the future. And optimism about the possibility that we will find the solutions to the huge problems that we face and that we humans have created by our own creativity.
Yes, and there's of course a level of importance in communicating to try to get these problems out of the way. And I think the main issue we deal with, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is to a certain extent greed. And we've also created this thing called wealth and money, and there's a greedy thing that's going on in the world at the moment that people almost will do whatever they need to do to get a certain level of wealth in their lives, and whether that be destroying the planet or destroying the individuals around them in the society. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, I think I do. And of course, it depends how you define greed. As individuals, we're designed by biology to seek our own survival and future. So something that you might call selfishness is sort of built into us, but it's not the only thing that's built into us. We're a profoundly social species. You talked earlier about happiness. Now, I do not want to pretend I'm a guru on happiness, but there are certain things that we do know. We know we're a profoundly social species. That a sense of being connected to other people, a sense of being involved in a common project, such as the projects we've been talking about, this project of finding a way to solve the challenges we face as humans. that sense of being connected to a shared project with perhaps millions of other people can give a profound sense of meaning and satisfaction to people's lives. So that greed is short-sighted psychologically, because I do not believe that greed in a narrow sense is really a recipe for happiness or fulfillment. We're a very social species, and we are increasingly part of a global community. And seeing ourselves as part of that community, I believe, is a crucial part of looking for a sense of fulfillment in our life. And a sense of fulfillment, a sense of purpose, is fundamental to our sense of well-being, of happiness, of self-respect.
Yeah, and in your experience, are there any key lessons or insights that young people can learn from studying history? And how can we apply these lessons to our own lives?
That's a really difficult one, because most historians that I know, and I've been a professional historian all my life, are very nervous about trying to draw lessons from history. Of course, there are lessons in history, but there are good lessons and bad lessons. Um, and it is a really tricky thing to draw lessons from history. But I've been involved, as you know, for many years in the project of trying to look at the past on very large scales.
Yep.
And I think that looking at the past on large scales can generate powerful insights. And one of them I've talked about already. It's about the nature of our species, this astonishing creativity that we have collectively. Um, I think the lesson of history is that has been persistent throughout human history, and we should expect it to continue into the near future. As I said earlier, I think that's one cause for optimism.
And there's a theme throughout the podcast, which is addressing social challenges faced by teenagers and humans as a whole. Based on your understanding of history, what are some historical examples of movements that young people can draw inspiration from in their efforts to drive positive change and tackle all these social issues we're dealing with today?
Today, and I'm comparing today's world with the world that I lived in as a kid in the middle of the 20th century, utterly different world. Today, there are so many organizations that are committed to a sort of global perspective. I'm thinking of wonderful organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, people who commit themselves to trying to do good in every nation on earth. Oxfam, I've been a supporter of for many, many years. But they're also political institutions. The United Nations, for all its limitations, is a remarkable institution because it brings together all countries on earth. And increasingly in recent years, it has brought them together around challenges such as sustainability and climate change. So if you want to participate in this project of solving the problems we face, I think there are many, many opportunities, and the number of opportunities are growing. And I think it's going to grow very, very fast indeed during the sort of technological revolution, which is just around the corner, the technological revolution that will lead us to a world in which we have enough energy to support good lifestyles, but the production of that energy is not destroying the sort of biological and climatological underpinnings of our lives.
And
I
you
believe
mentioned,
it. I think it's when I was a kid, I went to a school, an international school called Atlantic College. That was a big breakthrough. The idea that you might have a college that would have people from many different nations seemed like a breakthrough. Today, the opportunities for travel, for traveling, around the world, for communicating with other people, for working in organizations that are committed to building a good future. There are so many opportunities.
Yeah, and you mentioned life and the world when you were a kid, or should I say a teenager. How has that life, your personal life, influenced your drive to go into the space of studying history?
Ah, I yeah, I was I lived in Nigeria as a child. My dad was a colonial officer. He was part of British imperialism. I then went to schools in England. I think growing up in Nigeria sort of inoculated me against some of the cruder forms of patriotism and nationalism that were alive and well in post-war Britain. Um, I could never, I could never take seriously the idea that Britain had got it all right, or that Britain was the greatest nation on earth, because I'd lived in Nigeria. I knew I had wonderful friends as a kid in Nigeria. Um, so I think that experience, my mother was American. She was born in Beijing. My parents met in Turkey at the end of the war. I grew up in Nigeria. My wife is American. We met in Canada. I live in Australia. All these experiences, I think, help explain why I could never take too seriously the sort of nationalistic bias that I think is deeply embedded in modern education and in history teaching. I was a Russian teacher, Russian history teacher. So in effect, I was teaching the subliminal message that there is this thing called Russianness. Now, that's a message that Vladimir Putin is now touting on a big scale. I don't think it's a helpful message. It encourages conflict, rather than the message we need now, which is that humans are humans. I mean, it's a cliche, but and we're now so interdependent that we need to be working together. I think my own childhood really biased me towards a sort of global thinking that saw humans as humans.
Yeah,
That may sound
and
sentimental. I hope you know what I mean.
no, no, I absolutely do. And if you could go back in time and have a conversation with one historical figure, who would it be and why? What would you ask them?
Oh, can you give me a moment to think about this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, Look, I'd be very tempted to say it would be someone like Nelson Mandela. I I'm not an expert on Mandela, but I think his career as someone who he very privileged background, a boxer, aggressive, a fighter, uh, then lives, was it 17 years in solitary confinement? I visited his cell on my one trip to South Africa, and then comes out at a turning point in South African history and talks across the divisions, talks about the need for reconciliation. That was not easy to do, given his own background and also given the political situation. I once heard Desmond Tutu talking about what an astonishing moment that was. And that's the sort of change in thinking that we need more and more in today's world. Something like reconciliation. Whether we'll actually achieve it, I don't know. But I think someone like Mandela points the way. Gandhi is a similar figure. Also, of course, grew up in South Africa.
I completely agree. I mean, I grew up in Cape Town, as I don't know if I've mentioned that to you, but he's a true hero in our country. And as you mentioned, we need more people like that to step out of their comfort zone and try to tackle what isn't actually a single country's problem at the moment because of all the technology, as we've spoken about. It's actually a world problem, and we need a few historical figures from a few big countries to try tackle this issue that we're dealing with. I'm going to shift our focus more towards an historical event. And is there a specific historical event that has inspired you personally, and explain how this story or an individual story can motivate young people to try face this adversity?
Oh, look, history is full of sort of catastrophic blunders, but it's also full of astonishing heroism. I mean, again, Mandela, I guess, is an example. So that this is a very old-fashioned way of looking at history. The Greeks and Romans used to think that the value of history was that it was full of exemplars of what you should do and shouldn't do. And to some extent, that's absolutely true. So yeah, I wouldn't pick a single figure. There are many figures. I mean, the Germans who protected Jews during the Holocaust. I think today, I'm a Russian historian, so I follow as closely as I can what's going on in Russia. Figures like the former opposition leader, Navalny, he's poisoned. He goes abroad. He could have stayed abroad. He comes back to Russia, knowing that he's probably going to end up in prison, maybe being slowly poisoned in prison. We just don't know. But that his return will inspire people. I mean, you don't have to look far in history to look for many remarkable examples of people who have taken huge risks for the sake of their community and for the sake of a larger community.
I agree. And then to end us off, if you could go back and say one thing to your 16-year-old self, what would that be?
What would I say to my 16-year-old self? Gosh, I'm improvising. It would be, hang in there, mate. Life will throw challenges at you all the time. But never forget that it'll also throw wonderful moments at you. So your job is to hang in through the difficult moments. Ideally, of course, with the help of those around you, because it's a privilege to be alive. Think of all the people, this is a paradoxical way of putting it, but think of all the people who were never alive and all the beings that were never alive. There's a nice little trope in Buddhist thought. The Buddha used to say, be thankful for being alive. The odds of being alive are just astonishingly huge. The odds of not being alive are astonishingly huge. You won the lottery by being alive. You will go through really bad times, but hang in there, because life is difficult, but it's also absolutely wondrous and dazzlingly spectacular.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. And I really do appreciate this opportunity to have a talk with you. So thanks again.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks
Cool.
for some very interesting questions.
Thank you for listening to that episode of Graded Podcast with historian David Christian. See you next time.